Okay, time for Chapter 3, the settling of the northern colonies, and this includes both New England colonies and a short look at the founding of the middle colonies. So, before we get into the actual colonies themselves, we need to talk about some of the reasons behind their founding. But the Protestant Reformation going like crazy or spreading like crazy across Europe in the 1500s, it all began with Martin Luther when he began to reform the church, or the Catholic Church, with his 95 Theses. He simply disapproved of a lot of things they were doing as they weren't biblical in their teaching, and so his ideas spread like wildfire across Europe because someone was finally able to challenge the Catholic Church. John Calvin followed along in his footsteps, leading with his own ideas, including teachings on predestination and conversion that differed greatly from that of the Catholic Church, and really took root with a lot of Christian followers in Europe. These two men were followed pretty quickly by King Henry VIII, who, with the growing Protestant Reformation, felt comfortable in breaking from the Catholic Church. As we mentioned in Chapter 2, this was mostly because he wanted a son, but he did create the Church of England. The problem with the Church of England, however, in many Protestant Christians' eyes, is that he had brought over all of the Catholic ideas, simply changing leadership rather than the Pope, changing hands to the King or Queen of England. Many Christians inside of the Church of England wanted it to be purified, and they were called the Puritans. But a more radical group were called the Separatists, who wanted to wholly separate from the Church of England because they believed you needed to start over from scratch with a biblical mindset. So these Separatists, no surprise, began to be looked down upon by the monarchs in England because they felt threatened. So a group of Separatists in 1608 actually left England and fled to Holland after King James I threatened to, hurt them. We'll just leave it at that. But after a few years of living in Holland, however, these group of pilgrims found themselves frustrated with the Dutchification of their children. They wanted to keep their English culture, language, customs, and so they decide to change path and sail to the New World. They actually get approval by the crown to go and join the Virginia colony. However, when they finally make it to America, they actually land in Plymouth Bay, much further north. Rather than correct themselves, they decide to stay there because, well, it was going to allow them to worship and live and grow a culture and a colony all of their own. So on their way over there on the Mayflower, their ship, they do sign a compact, which created an agreement to form a government and submit to the will of the majority. This is one of the first examples of democracy. It goes along with the House of Burgesses and something called the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut we'll go over in a minute. Regardless, the Pilgrims come over here, and with William Bradford leading them, they're able to make it through a couple tough winters to become a successful settlement. Meanwhile, back in England, groups of Puritans who had been previously enjoying, I guess you could say, tolerance from the crown, even though they were challenging some of their ideas. In 1629, Charles I changes that attitude and begins to persecute the Puritans. He dismisses Parliament and tries to force all the Puritans to yield to his authority and tried to force them to become a Catholic nation. So with this happening, a lot of Puritans decided they would rather go somewhere else. And so the Great Migration of the 1630s begins when the Puritans are given a charter to create a colony at Massachusetts Bay in America. This Great Migration brings over tens of thousands of Puritans, and they were led by men like John Winthrop and Cotton Mather's. John Winthrop, on his way over there, gives a speech called the Model Christian Society, and in it he says that they're going to be a city on a hill. The whole world will be looking at them to be Christians standing out, and they were going to be the Christian example. They couldn't fail because otherwise people would look down upon the church and them as bad Christians. So when they get over here, they create their own culture and their own colony, which would be different from that of the Church of England. So the Bay Colony was not, however, a democracy. Only males in the church could vote, and everybody in the colony paid taxes to support the church. Now, church membership was actually selective. Not everyone who showed up got to join. Instead, you first had to have a visible experience with God, and then also had to be given approval by leaders like John Winthrop that they believed your story. So they could actually limit the political and religious lives of their citizens if they didn't like them by simply denying them church membership, which then denied them the ability to vote in the colony as well. So naturally, with leaders like these, although they were passionate and certainly did their best to serve God and how they saw fit, unfortunately, they did enforce strict moral codes. So John Cotton and Bay Colony leaders instituted things called the Connecticut Blue Laws. If you look on OneNote, you'll see some examples of these blue laws and just how harsh they were. All of them had a biblical basis, but, well, the punishment for nearly all of them was death. Puritans did enjoy simple pleasures despite this strict moral code, but some human instincts were repressed, especially that of sexuality. But life and work were very serious because, well, they had to be serious if they wanted to survive. Challenges to them naturally developed because of these strict codes and strict laws. Quakers who migrated to the area refused to give Puritan clergy proper respect because Quakers believed that all men were equal, and so rather than call someone pastor or lord, they would instead call them brother or sister. So, because of this refusal to give due respect, according to men like John Winthrop, they were frequently persecuted. Not to mention, they also refused to pay taxes because that would fund the war, and they were pacifists. And so, combine those things together, and you have a group who's looked down upon. Then, one major figure, which you see the picture, or a depiction of her rather, to the left. In 1638, a woman named Anne Hutchinson challenged the teachings on predestination. She held home Bible studies, and she discussed, not necessarily supported, it depends on which sources you read, but antinomianism, which is a very extreme view of predestination, that because God already knows where you're going, it doesn't matter if you're good or bad because, well, he's already decided. So because she questioned church leadership, she was put on trial. And although she put up a great defense, making John Winthrop and other Massachusetts Bay leaders look silly, she eventually is exiled. Unfortunately for her, she has a miscarriage on her way out, and then eventually where she settles, she is killed by Indians, which, well, John Winthrop celebrated as God's divine justice. Another key figure that challenges the leaders of the Bay Colony was Roger Williams. Roger Williams did not like the idea of regulating religious behavior through laws. He also was very strong against forcing people to pay taxes towards a church that they were not members of. Since everybody in Massachusetts Bay had to pay for the local churches, that was unfair to groups like Quakers or other Protestant groups who didn't support their views. So what Roger Williams ends up doing is getting put on trial for challenging Winthrop and the other leaders. Luckily for him, he does escape, and with the help of the local Indian tribe, is able to create his own colony. He does pay those Native Americans for their land and treats them fairly, and he begins to attract a specific group of people that we would call religious dissidents or outcasts, like Quakers. So the Rhode Island had complete religious freedom and became a place where dissenters and exiles ran away from places like Massachusetts Bay or any other place that they could be persecuted from. So Rhode Island quickly became strongly independent and individualistic. In many ways, it was like North Carolina of New England, different than the areas around them because of their population being, well, kind of outcasts. So New England begins to spread out, and basically the entire area was not necessarily fertile, but it certainly was being flooded by Puritans in the 1630s. So because there was not enough space for those people living in places like Boston or Salem or Plymouth, they spread out pretty quickly across the area. So Massachusetts Bay for a long time controlled all of those colonies that you see in that picture. They absorbed New Hampshire, they controlled Maine all the way to 1820 actually. They controlled Connecticut and Plymouth. Of course, Rhode Island eventually breaking away, but all those areas were actually controlled by Massachusetts. But as those new settlements at places like New Haven and Hartford are created, Connecticut creates its own modern constitution called the Fundamental Orders. Much like the House of Burgesses and the Mayflower Compact, this creates kind of a democratic situation that, well, allows people to be represented. Beyond that, King Charles II didn't really like this region simply because groups like Massachusetts were constantly undermining his authority as the leader of the church and even as a political leader as they continued to establish more and more political authority. So this brings us to how did they interact with Native Americans? We all know the story of how the Plymouth colony befriended Squanto and the Wampanoag Indians, and for a long time that peace lasted for over 50 years. So Chief Massasoit and William Bradford signed that treaty in 1621, and peace lasts all the way to 1675 and 1676 when we have a war. So although the settlers were friendly with the Wampanoag Indians, that does not mean they got along with any of the other groups. One group called the Pequots were resistant to trade and the relationships that the English had with the other tribes. So they fight a war in 1637. The New England settlers, along with the rival Mohegan tribe, end up destroying the Pequots. And the savage nature with which the Puritans smite the Pequots puts a lot of fear in the following tribes. Some of them even leave the area recognizing that the Puritans really were not going to be their friends. Instead, they were kind of on their own path to taking over the entire region. So with that said, what about the Wampanoag tribe? Well, in King Philip's War, we see their relationship with the Wampanoags dwindle into warfare. for two major reasons. First, the English are infringing on their land. With those tens of thousands of settlers growing into tens of thousands more settlers, where are they going to live but further west? So as the English begin to expand more and more into Wampanoag and other natives' territories, they begin to resent that presence. And then finally, the Puritans in the New England region went about Christianizing these Indians. And while maybe that seems fine by us because we are typically American and a predominantly Christian nation, for Native Americans, this was a complete dismantling of their culture and their faith. And so the son of Massasoit, after his father passes away, his name was actually Metacom, but you'll see that the English gave him the name King Philip. And he resented the cultural and economic pressure of the English. So what he does is he forges an alliance between many of the tribes in the area to try to get rid of the English because, well, he saw the future of them wiping them out and pushing them further west or ruining their culture and ending their way of life as they knew it forever. So in 1675, when he attacks, they quickly are able to push back many of the New England settlers toward the coast. You can see on this picture attacks and battles all over the entire New England region. Unfortunately for Mr. Metacom, or King Philip, well, they ran out of supplies. The English were constantly being reinforced from the sea while he was running out of weapons and gunpowder and food. The English, whenever they would lead a raid, would simply burn down the fields and the crops. And so when the winter would set in, the Native Americans would struggle pretty badly, while again, the English were being reinforced. So after King Philip is defeated, the English are able to push back all the Native Americans from the New England region. And for the most part, New England doesn't really deal with a Native American threat for a very long time. So then we have the seeds of colonial unity and independence. And by colonial unity, we mean colonies coming together and independence overall away from the English crown. So because of a civil war happening at home between Catholics and Puritans, England began to neglect the colonies, allowing them to basically do as they saw fit. So in 1643, 4 colonies formed the New England Confederation. So in New England, this was a completely Puritan-based club in which those 4 colonies were able to protect both their religious beliefs and also form somewhat of a political independent body. The Confederation was formed mostly to protect themselves from outside pressures and Native Americans, but each colony each had 2 votes in the decisions they made. Now, if you think about it, this overshadows pretty well the future American government, in which we'll have a Senate in which every state has 2 votes. So New England, for the first time in American history, we see the settlers or the people living in America combine to try to form their own kind of independent government. Unfortunately, after Oliver Cromwell, the Puritan leader, passes away, a new king takes over, and he does not like what he sees in the colonies. So what he does is he tries to rein them back in, and when Massachusetts and other New England areas resist him, he fights back by first granting new charters to Connecticut and Rhode Island as separate colonies. But then he revokes their charter and creates the Dominion of New England. Now, looking at the map here, you can see that all those colonies were put under the control of the man named Edmund Andros in this picture. So Edmund Andros was brought in to control the colonies. So first, he forced all of them to attend the Church of England, which is not only submitting to the king's authority as a religious leader, but also undoing the entire reason why these groups came to settle in the New World. This got rid of their way of worshiping exactly how they saw fit. Second, by getting rid of their town hall meetings, he was able to stop them from also expressing themselves politically. So we have religious restrictions, we have political restrictions, and then on this page you can see that Navigation Acts, which had actually been passed in 1650, that only allowed colonies to trade with England. But because they'd been neglected, the colonies, they had been able to trade with whoever they wanted to make the most money possible. When the Navigation Acts are finally enforced by Edmund Andros in the Dominion of New England, it completely crushes colonial profits. It also encourages them to smuggle and begin breaking the law, a theme that we see pretty prevalent throughout early American history, even going into the Revolutionary period. So why would the English enact things like the Navigation Acts? Well, this was based on the belief called mercantilism. And mercantilism, in the big sense, is that nations believe that gold equaled power. And so the more gold that nation had, the more power they had. So if you allow your colonies to trade with other nations, those other nations make more money, and thus they gain more gold, and thus they gain more power. So if you stop your colonies from trading with anyone besides the mother nation, in this case, for our colonies, England, then it can only benefit the mother nation, and other nations don't benefit. So they restricted, through the Navigation Acts, the economic livelihoods. So you have the economic, religious, and political livelihood of Americans being affected. So just as they're beginning to grow in their resentment and consider throwing off the control of Andros and his dominion, there is a revolution in England. This overthrows the Catholic King James II, and King William and Mary take over. When they do, the Dominion of New England collapses, and Andros is expelled to England. He luckily escaped death just out of plain, well, I guess you could say mercy from the settlers. However, Massachusetts remained a royal colony. But here's where the big change occurs. The colonies remained resistant to English control and frustrated with dealing with their rebellious mindset. William and Mary decided to begin a period of what we call salutary neglect toward the Navigation Acts. Now, the word salutary itself means beneficial, so technically it's beneficial neglect. They allow the colonies to trade freely as long as they were profitable to the crown. That says crow, it's supposed to say crown. Several typos in here I really need to fix. So what does this mean? It basically means that the colonies can trade with Spain and France and ignore those laws as long as Britain is still seeing a large amount of profits from them. So, what does this turn into and why is it so important? From the Glorious Revolution onward, the colonies were given this freedom. So all the way from the 1680s into the 1760s, the colonies are able to ignore the Navigation Acts and trade however they want and ignore many of the restrictions placed on other colonies. After the French and Indian War ends in 1763, England finds itself in massive debt, and they say to themselves, what's the easiest way to pay back our debts? Oh, we can just enforce the laws we already have in effect. In other words, we're not going to pass more laws to restrict any of our colonies. We're just going to enforce what we already have. So because the colonies were so profitable, they were, well, pretty largely affected by this sudden change in policy. So the colonies throw a fit over this, and I've always described it as a teenager getting their car taken away. Let's say they're good when they were 16 and 17 years old, but then the parents all of a sudden when they turn 18 get scared because another friend does something dumb with their car, and they decide that they can't drive their car anymore. That teenager would naturally throw a fit because he'd had this freedom he had been taking advantage of and used wisely, and yet suddenly has it taken away unjustly. And so the colonies do the same thing, throw a fit over this. A power struggle begins. Both sides are stubborn, and a war happens, which creates creates America. Woohoo! Yeah. So America is born because of salutary neglect, something that we'll cover in depth in a future chapter. So New England is obviously a very influential area, but the middle colonies are also influential, maybe not so much in that they build up and resist, but certainly were very profitable. But let's go over really quickly how each one was founded. New York was first founded by the Dutch as simply a profitable enterprise looking to make money off fishing and make money off of the beaver fur trade like the French had been. But when the English suddenly decide that it's theirs, and literally the king declares it as his territory and gives a grant to his brother, the Duke of York, the English just sail over and take it by force. Although there's not a fight, all the population wanted to do was to keep their current culture, which in New York consisted of a diverse and tolerant group with many nationalities and religions. They were afraid the English would take that away, but when the English agree that they will allow them to keep that culture and that tolerance there, New Amsterdam surrenders to the Duke of York and it becomes New York. Pennsylvania, meanwhile, was founded as a Quaker haven by William Penn. He had been converted to the Quaker religion, and because he started becoming an outcast, he wanted to find a way for him and his fellow Quakers to, well, safely practice their faith. So he asked the king for a favor because his father had been loyal, and so the king grants him a charter in Pennsylvania, which is technically Penn's Woods, and so he is able to bring a lot of people over there because of all the land at his disposal. He advertises large tracts of lands for sale if settlers would just come. And so just like New York, it attracts a large, diverse group living there. And so that's kind of one of the major themes of these middle colonies. It's just how welcoming they were to all groups. Then you have New Jersey. New Jersey is pretty simple. The Duke of York grants a large portion of land to two of his English aristocrat buddies. And, well, that's pretty much it. He just grants it to his friends. And then you have Delaware, originally founded by Sweden, but was seized by the English in similar fashion to New York. So the middle colonies, the main themes there as far as their founding is that they are diverse, founded by other groups for the most part. And then when they're taken by the English, unlike the area of New England, they're allowed to continue practicing whatever faith they see fit, whether that be Judaism, even atheism, and, well, as long as they are living good lives as citizens, they're allowed to practice those faiths. So that is it for Chapter 3. I hope this helps, and if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. That's it. Have a good one.